clashes erupt between Palestinians and Israeli occupation forces in occupied Al-Quds following the murder of a Palestinian teenager. The latest round of nuclear negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 kick off in Vienna after Tehran warned that excessive demands would hinder the talks. Moscow and Kiev agree on a roadmap of measures for ending the crisis in Ukraine. And the Iraqi army makes further advances against Islamic State militants in the strategic city of Tikrit. Welcome to Al World News. I'm Mariam Khantar. Fierce clashes have erupted between Palestinians and occupation forces in occupied Al-Quds after a Palestinian teenage body was found dead, leaving President Mahmoud Abbas pointing the finger at the Israeli entity.
As the news of the killing of a Palestinian in a revenge attack spread, crowds of angry Palestinians gathered outside the teenager's home in eastern Al-Quds, where clashes erupted with occupation forces who shot sound grenades and tear gas to disperse the crowd. The teenager was identified as 16-year-old Mohammed Hussein Abu Khader, whose body was discovered dumped in a forest. The finding was confirmed by Israeli police shortly after the family reported him missing, but has refused to hand over the body. Eyewitnesses said two settlers forcibly pulled the boy inside a Hyundai before speeding off while the teen was heading to a nearby mosque for early morning prayers. A wave of clashes was also seen in Sha'afat village and Bet Hanina, where Zionist forces fired rubber bullets at protesters, injuring at least 80. Similar acts of aggression took place in the Al-Aqsa Mosque after occupation forces stormed the compound and attempted to enter it after having blocked a number of roads, resulting to its closure. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who had condemned the abduction of the Israeli trio, held Tel Aviv responsible for the murder.
First of all, we strongly condemn the kidnapping of the settlers and the killing of this Palestinian young man in cold blood, and we hold the Israeli government responsible. Secondly, we demand that the Israeli Prime Minister condemns this crime, particularly after the Palestinian side already condemned the killing of the 3 Israelis.
Meanwhile, Hamas said the Israeli entity would pay the price for the killing of Abu Khader. In the first sign of retaliation, Palestinian resistance groups launched 10 rockets at Israeli settlements from the Gaza Strip. For its part, the White House condemned the killing of the Palestinian teenager and urged authorities to exercise restraint.
The United States condemns in the strongest possible terms the heinous murder of Palestinian teenager Mohammed Hussein Abu Khader. We send our condolences to his family and to the Palestinian people. We note that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has called upon law enforcement authorities to work as quickly as possible to identify the perpetrators and motives behind this heinous act, and we hope to swiftly see the guilty parties brought to justice. We call on the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority to take all necessary steps to prevent an atmosphere of revenge and retribution.
The tension in the occupied territories has reached boiling point amid 2 weeks of escalating Israeli aggression against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, where 15 Palestinians have been killed and more than 40 detained overnight, as several homes were also demolished. As heavy clashes continue, the question remains, will this latest round of violence lead to an all-out war being launched by the Israelis yet again against the Palestinians?
Alberto Watson is a journalist and a political analyst, and he says that the brutal killing of the Palestinian teenager was nothing more than revenge by the Israelis.
I think it's a very coward way of expressing a revenge act by kidnapping a 16-year-old, burning the body. It has signs of being stabbed, so it's been brutally murdered and dumped on a side on a road in the West Jerusalem side. So This comes definitely after the calls that most of the Zionist politicians have made for revenge over the Palestinian population that is already suffering a collective punishment by the Israeli army and actually the Israeli authorities. I think that this violence is really going to go beyond the control of the Israeli authorities, and it can only take to one thing. The way that I see it is that the Third Intifada is just a few steps from becoming a reality. The way that we see it also, Gaza being also target. What's the reason of Gaza? Gaza is totally isolated from the West Bank. What should the Gaza people have to do with the presumed kidnapping of these 3 Israeli teens and its killing, if it's true that it happened? I mean, why? The interest here is basically get rid of Hamas, finish Hamas, and finish the unity government that Hamas and Fatah has created recently. And any chance, any possibility that they have to attack, if it's the people, if it's the workers, if it's the farmers, if it's the fishermen, any excuse whatsoever to attack the Gaza Strip. And now it comes this great possibility of flattening, like Avigdor Lieberman, the Minister of Exteriors, has presented as a project. Let's flatten down Gaza, let's bomb it. I mean, he already came a few years ago, 6-7 years ago, in the elections and the campaign, talking about throwing an atomic bomb over Gaza to finish with the problem and the violence coming from Gaza. Absolutely finished with those peace talks. It was never a possibility of reaching any peace treaty, any agreement between the Israeli negotiators and the Palestinian Authority. Abbas has shown to be very weak, extremely weak, but because at the same time that it was taking place, these negotiations, Palestinian homes were demolished, raids were happening constantly over Gaza, and new buildings and new units were built. So you cannot commit to peace when actually you are committing the most atrocious acts of violence.
Before heading to the Austrian capital Vienna for the 6th and final round of talks with the P5+1 group of countries over Iran's nuclear energy program, Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif sent a video message concerning the sanctions the West has applied on the Islamic Republic. Zarif urged world powers to seize this opportunity to end the crisis.
Sanctions were crippling, even deadly, literally. But sanctions did not cripple our nuclear program. Neither did the murder of our nuclear scientists, the sabotage of our nuclear facilities with potentially disastrous environmental ramifications, or the repeated military threats. I can only say that pressure has been tried for the past 8 years. In fact, for the past 35 years. It didn't bring the Iranian people to kneel in submission, and it will not now, nor in the future. We still have time to exit this spiral of escalation. Try mutual respect. It works. We are trying to reach a deal, not a good deal or a bad deal, but a doable and lasting deal.
Iran and the 6 world powers started a new round of talks in Vienna in pursuit of a comprehensive deal to resolve the dispute over Tehran's nuclear program, which has dragged on for over a decade. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton, who coordinates the talks on behalf of the 6 major powers, held a meeting on Wednesday evening. Later, Zarif, Ashton, and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State William Burns also held trilateral talks. Earlier, Foreign Minister Zarif met the Chinese and Russian envoys before meeting Ashton. Upon arrival in the Austrian capital, Zarif said Iranian negotiators have come to Vienna fully prepared to reach an agreement. The chief Iranian nuclear negotiator expressed hope that the other side would show the required political will to reach an accord. He also said that excessive demands on the part of the 6 world powers will block the progress of the talks, adding that the Islamic Republic will not accept excessive demands. The talks, which are expected to continue at least until July 15th, are meant to build on a landmark interim nuclear deal Iran and the 5+1 group clinched last November in Geneva. Tehran and the P5+1 group of countries have set a July 20th deadline to to seal a long-term comprehensive nuclear deal. The deadline can be extended by another half year if both sides agree. Now all hopes are on a diplomatic marathon set to begin on Thursday between Iran and the P5+1 group to bring an end to the decade-old nuclear dispute.
Political analyst Mustafa Koshasheshim joins me now from the Iranian capital Tehran to discuss this further. Thanks a lot for joining us. Can we expect a permanent nuclear accord to be struck before the July 20th deadline, especially with such existing obstacles as uranium enrichment and the lifting of sanctions?
In the name of God the Almighty, hello to you and your audience, and thank you very much for having me on your program again. The point is that, as I said before, I think it was a few weeks ago that I told you that it all depends on the West. See, as Mr. Foreign Minister, Mr. Javad Zarif, has said in his 4 or 5 minute message today, this is the West who should decide to stop its excessive demands. Actually, the Western states, led by the US, are looking for maximalist demands, and they want the maximum level of their aspirations to come true. There was a time, a few years ago, when they were looking for the same thing. Actually, they didn't accept Iran having any kind of nuclear program at all. Even they were opposing Iran's use of nuclear power plants like Bushehr. Several countries in the region like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the UAE and others have started signing contracts or even building nuclear power plants. So this is, everybody knows that this is something normal and the civilian use of the nuclear technology. But then, a few years ago, they didn't even accept Iran having nuclear power plants. Little by little, they came to realize that this is an unrealistic and, not a good and proper position. And they came to realize that Iran is now an established nuclear state, no matter they like it or not. So they changed their mindset. Now the same thing is true this time. This time they should change their mindset. What is going on is that they think the reason for Iran to come to the negotiating table is the pressure of their sanctions. And they think and they imagine that their sanctions have crippled the Iranian state and the government and brought them to the negotiating table. So they are looking for maximalist demands, and as Mr. Zarif said, they are pursuing the game of the chicken in order to get the most out of these negotiations. But they should come to realize that this has not been the reason why Iran has come to the negotiating table. They should change their mindset. They should come to realize that this is an only opportunity, a historic opportunity, and they will lose this opportunity and miss this chance if they want to continue the same treatment. If you look at Mr. Zarif's statements, the last time that they were in Vienna last month, when they were going out, Mr. Zarif said it seems that the opposite side, at least the Western members of the P5+1, are not serious in the negotiations. So he seemed, or he sounded a little bit pessimistic. I don't want to say that he was completely pessimistic, but he seemed a little bit pessimistic. Opposite the, contrary to the previous rounds in Vienna 1, 2, 3, 4, when he sounded very optimistic about reaching a deal. Now, this time, when he arrived in Vienna, he told reporters, and also he repeated it in today's message, that the other side should show that it's serious. The other side has repeatedly stressed that Iran is serious in the negotiations. Now Iran expects the opposite side to prove that it's serious, because what they are talking about is impossible to come true. The several hundred centrifuges, for example, this is one of the points of difference between the two sides. this is not pragmatic demand. Iran will never accept such a thing, and because of its needs, the other side, the Western side, should at least show that it's loyal to the Geneva interim deal, where both sides, Iran and the six world powers, signed a treaty which said that Iran's enrichment program will be working, and of course it will be working in order to meet Iran's practical needs. One of these practical needs is fuel. Of course, there needs to be time to talk about it, to say to your audience how many centrifuges are needed only for the Bushehr power plant, which produces 1,000 megawatt of nuclear power. How many centrifuges Iran needs for that. If you know that, then you come to realize that several hundred centrifuges means just a joke.
So, based on the U.S.'s track record, can Tehran rest assured that Washington will abide by any agreement that's reached?
Actually, this is another problem. If you just look back in the last several decades or the several centuries, at least whatever the history says and the recorded history says, Iran has always been loyal to its undertakings, but with regard to international rules, multilateral and bilateral treaties and agreements, Iran has always proved to be loyal. On the opposite side, the U.S. has always proved disloyal to its undertakings, at least with regard to Iran. Remember the agreements, the minimum agreements that they had with regard to Iraq when the U.S. invaded Saddam Hussein, or the Afghan invasion in 2001. Remember that, the agreement between Tehran and the U.S. Of course, there were minimum agreements, like if planes crashed, the U.S. fighter jets crashed, and their pilots could escape to Iran, then Iran accepted to allow them to go to their own country, things like this. But Iran stood by its undertakings and complied with its undertakings. But when it came to be the U.S. turn, Washington defied its undertakings. We all remember that after the U.S. invasion, when the U.S. occupied Baghdad, if you remember, they sent their choppers and military forces to the Iranian consulate in Erbil, and they kidnapped several Iranian diplomats in the Iranian consulate in there, despite the fact that everybody knows, according to the Geneva Convention, diplomats enjoy diplomatic immunity. And they didn't give back our diplomats to us for several months. After long negotiations, they eventually returned the diplomats to Iran. So you can see very easily that they are not, and they have not been complying with their undertakings. And Iran this time wants to make sure that the U.S. will abide by its commitments, especially when the U.S. in the last several months has shown after the Geneva interim deal, it has shown repeatedly in several cases that it's not complying even with its own commitments under the pretext of different interpretation. Even when they signed the treaty, Iran and the EU and Mrs. Ashton put it on the website, and everybody could go and see they were the same. But Washington and the White House especially, it released a kind of interpretation of the agreement, of the Geneva Agreement, which was totally different in form, in nature, and somehow in content. It was different from the original agreement. This shows that the United States is not really serious about what it takes inside and outside of the negotiating room.
All right, we will have to leave it there. Political analyst Mr. Mustafa Koshasheshim, thanks a lot for giving us your thoughts on that. Russia and Ukraine have agreed to work towards resuming a ceasefire, which would be made possible by starting three-way talks, including pro-Russian separatists, by this weekend.
A roadmap of measures that will point a way out of the Ukrainian crisis has been agreed to during four-way talks between the foreign ministers of Germany, France, Russia and Ukraine in Berlin. In their joint statement, the ministers called for the contact group to resume its work no later than July 5th, with the goal of reaching an unconditional and mutually agreed upon ceasefire.
I believe that today we succeeded to reach an agreement in the negotiations which are now behind us, an agreement on a package of measures which paves the way for a two-sided ceasefire.
The talks agreed to work towards resumption of trilateral contact group talks.
For his part, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that the group should include representatives of both Kiev and the self-defense forces of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Lavrov added that Moscow is ready to grant Ukraine border guards access to Russian territory so that they can control border crossings at several checkpoints while the mutually agreed-upon ceasefire is in place. On the ground in Ukraine, the residents of Kramatorsk were forced to endure a long night of consistent shelling by Kiev's troops, which have used all means at their disposal to target pro-Russian rebels in the east. In the center of the city, Ukrainian tanks shelled a residential area. 6 civilians were killed while many others were injured.
Everything has been destroyed. It's terrible what happened to my flat. All the glass shattered. Terrifying. It was terrifying.
A response by pro-Russian activists was swift. Self-defense forces retaliated with mortar attacks on a border post in Donetsk. One Ukrainian soldier was killed, while another 4 were injured. Now all eyes are on the Berlin Agreement. Should it succeed, the accord will finally bring about the much-anticipated peace in the country.
Do stay with us here at Al World News. Still ahead. Sarkozy faces corruption probe. Let's have another look at our top stories this hour. Fierce clashes erupt between Palestinians and Israeli occupation forces in occupied Al-Quds following the murder of a Palestinian teenager. The latest round of nuclear negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 kick off in Vienna after Tehran warned that excessive demands would hinder the talks. Moscow and Kiev agree on a roadmap of measures for ending the crisis in Ukraine. And the Iraqi army makes further advances against Islamic State militants in the strategic city of Tikrit. The Iraqi army has made major advances in the northern city of Tikrit in the Salahuddin province as it retook the 4th Division base from extremist militants who have pledged allegiance to the so-called Islamic State.
If words aren't enough to show what is happening on the ground amid Iraq's security crisis, then the picture should suffice. The Iraqi Defense Ministry has broadcast footage of its troops carrying out military operations in Tikrit University, which has been recaptured from Islamic State militants. Iraqi forces have made major advances in the northern city of Tikrit and have even retaken the 4th Division base, which had fallen in the hands of Islamic State militants. Iraqi security sources announced that government forces are pushing toward the center of Tikrit after they cleansed the highway linking the city to Samarra from explosive devices. Thousands of soldiers backed by the country's air force and armored divisions clashed with Islamic State militants in Tikrit, where a decisive battle is shaping the future of the country's security. Meanwhile, Iraqi forces continued their counter-offensive against the al-Qaeda-affiliated group elsewhere in Iraq, particularly in the provinces of Anbar and Diyala, where soldiers eradicated scores of militants.
Air Force and Air Defense Commands have conducted 121 raids over the past 24 hours, targeting selected targets in different areas, and there were quality strikes in Sherkat, in central Tikrit, in Udaim east of Diyala, north of Jurf al-Shakhar and Haditha.
Iraqi fighter jets have killed more than 70 militants northwest of the city of Hilla in the Babel province, in a sign that the Iraqi army is pounding the extremists amid an all-out operation aimed at restoring much-needed stability in the country.
Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has reiterated that Baghdad's priority is the country's security crisis and fighting terrorism groups to protect the unity of Iraq. Maliki announced that the events on the battlefield have taken a turn in favor of the Iraqi security forces, stressing that some countries' mercenaries cannot defeat the Iraqi people. The Iraqi premier also stated that the recently established Islamic State is a message to all regional states, as he slammed the attempt by the semi-autonomous Kurdistan region to hold a referendum as unconstitutional.
Our priority today on the battlefield is security and its challenges and the sectarian-based plots of terrorist groups. The battle today is focused on security and the protection of Iraq and its people, and everything else at stake amid this fierce wave of terrorism which is seeking to destroy the accomplishments we have made in a democratic political process.
Let's cross over to our correspondent in Iraq, Mustafa Kattan, for more. Mustafa, just to update us, what is the latest coming out of the Salahuddin province?
Yes, in fact, according to the Iraqi Defense Ministry, the spokesperson of the Iraqi Defense Ministry stated that the Iraqi army today is having the upper hand in the fight. And the military operations have actually wiped out most of the militants from the province, especially in the outskirts of the city of Mosul. And right now, the military operations are concentrated on the center of the province of Salahuddin, as the city of Salahuddin right now is still under the control of the militants. According to the Defense Ministry, they say that the military operations inside the city of Salahuddin will be dependent or based on the intelligence reports which comes from inside the city of Mosul, according to the informers. In addition to, most of the military operations are relied on the Iraqi Air Force, which actually conducting 24/7 air patrols and airstrikes on the vital targets, according to the description of the Defense Ministry of the militants. The Iraqi army, according to most of the top security officials, they say that the regaining the province of Salahuddin is only a matter of time. And the updates, what is really happening on the ground of in the city of Mosul, most of the Iraqi army have been actually deployed, and they have intensified their presence in the outskirts of the city of Mosul as a preparation for another wide range of military operations inside the city of Mosul. And again, most of the military operations over there will be relied on the artillery and the air force. Yes.
And what about elsewhere? How far has the counteroffensive in the Anbar and Diyala provinces gone?
Yes, as I mentioned before, the war against the terrorism is actually taking the priority of the Iraqi Prime Minister and the Iraqi army. And right now, as I mentioned, and the high turnout of the volunteers who are actually showed willingness to join the Iraqi Air Force in their battle against the terrorism have actually enabled the Iraqi security forces to intensify their presence in these provinces, especially the provinces which witnesses the unrest and the presence of the militants. The province of Diyala is the situation over there is something different, as the tribal leaders over there, backed up by the volunteers and the Iraqi army, have actually changed the equation over there, as the Iraqi army over there stressing that again regaining the city of the lost villages of the city of Diyala is only a matter of time, especially as so far the military operations over there have deprived or stopped the progress of the militants from entering the city of Diyala. And so far, as I mentioned, the tribal leaders are still waiting for the militants to enter the city, as they have stated that the tribes will be fighting the terrorism wherever they are. Yes.
All right, our correspondent in Iraq, Wissam Al-Bayati, we appreciate those updates. Thanks a lot. Baghdad has confirmed that it received the second batch of Sukhoi warplanes from Russia as Iraqi troops press ahead with their counteroffensive against extremist militants. Russia began sending used fighter jets and military advisors to Iraq over the weekend in response to an appeal from the government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Today's arrival brings the number of Russian planes shipped to Iraq to 10. Just as fighting between the Iraqi army and Islamic State militants is intensifying across the country, the wave of volunteers signing up to join the battle against extremism is surging, with thousands of Iraqis rushing to the battlefronts.
The sun was at its zenith, which meant that the bus from Basra to Baghdad was about to take off. Iraqis volunteering to join the army in their battle against extremist militants hastened in endless rows to take their seats in the vehicle that would drive them to the battlefront. But before taking up arms in the middle of an offensive carried out by the so-called Islamic State, thousands of Iraqi volunteers kissed the Holy Quran and walked under it for blessings. Among the volunteers who are being sent to the front lines are former members of the Iraqi army and enlisters who have undergone military training.
The Jihad and Construction movement responded and formed the Al-Muntadhar Brigade. We now have 3,000 fighters. This is the first group, and it comprises 500 fighters, and we have coordinated with Baghdad Operation Command and the security forces, and we will send them to battlefronts today.
Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis have signed up to fight alongside government forces against militants, whether heeding the calls of the country's highest religious authority, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Sistani, or simply driven by a mere sense of patriotism and the duty to protect Iraq from such acts of aggression.
Al-Tajahs Between the Lines earlier hosted Hani Ali. He is the director of the Iraqi Center for Integration and Cohesion, and he said that the Islamic State militants do not have any meaningful presence in Iraq.
If ISIS control little towns, spotted or, sporadically around Iraq, first of all, that does not make them hold half of Iraq or a third of Iraq. And secondly, it's not even populated areas, so they can hold it as much as they want. At the end of the day, it's just a desert. On the other hand, we're not saying that peoples do not, or regional players do not have influence in Iraq. What I'm clearly saying is, if it was up to Iran's will, then they would probably bring Iraq nearer to the system or the regime that they have, the type of government that they have. Well, they did not do that. If it was up to the Americans, they probably would have preferred someone who's secular rather than somebody from the Islamic Dawah Party to rule Iraq for the past 8 years. What I'm saying is Iraq has very clearly proven itself as a sovereign country. Yes, we're facing a grave danger, exactly as the danger that the US, which has 100 times, which spends 100 times more on its defense than Iraq, faced in 9/11. We actually see the same threat that the UK saw on 7/7 and the UK spends 10 times as much as Iraq on its defense. So the idea that we're facing terrorism is very clear, but on the other hand, the sovereignty of Iraq, mainly in the heavily dense areas and populated areas of the south, is completely under the government. Baghdad, the capital, and the surrounding, or the so-called the Baghdad outskirt, is completely under the security forces. Apart from Fallujah and Mosul, ISIS do not really have any meaningful presence. If you want to get the facts from the ground, we really need to be a lot more proactive, like I said, to get the exact information. Now, they are taking heavy losses in Iraq. In fact, the ISIS losses in Iraq are much greater than the losses they faced in Syria, because there were some negotiations between the government at the time or the government of Assad and ISIS. In Iraq, they are taking heavy losses for a very simple reason. First of all, the government has a very strong backing from the population and clearly demonstrated by the elections. Secondly, the local government in Anbar, in Mosul, in Tikrit are Sunni local governments. They are elected from the people. They are actually people of that area. So at the end of the day, tribes and local people, local residents would not necessarily be happy with foreigners coming and taking over their cities. And the Gulf Institute in Washington, they have just presented a report which suggests that over 50% of ISIS are made up Saudis, and the rest are actually Chechens and Afghanis and Pakistanis and Arabs and Tunisians and Algerians and people who basically have absolutely no connection with the area.
Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been charged with corruption and influence peddling in a criminal investigation. The decision marks the first time a French head of state has been taken into custody.
France's former president, Nicolas Sarkozy, has been charged by prosecutors with corruption and influence peddling after 15 hours of interrogation by police officers in Paris. The 59-year-old French politician is suspected of influence peddling, corruption, and benefiting from, quote, the breach of professional secrets, in relation to allegations that he had solicited illegal funds for his re-election campaign from former Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Sarkozy's lawyer, Thierry Herzog, and a high-ranking judge, Gilbert Azibert, were also placed under formal probe as part of the inquiry. After the lengthy questioning session, the former president was taken in early Wednesday to appear before a judge, where he was put under formal investigation in what amounts to being charged based on preliminary evidence. He was then released while the investigation continues. If convicted, Sarkozy could face a sentence of up to 10 years in prison.
This situation is serious and the charges are serious, and furthermore they concern senior magistrates, a lawyer and a former president.
It is the second time the former president has been placed under such a judicial probe. In a previous case, Sarkozy was questioned concerning allegations that he had received illegal donations from French billionaire Yolande Bettencourt. The case was dropped in October 2013. Sarkozy has faced virtually non-stop legal battles since he left office following his defeat by socialist candidate François Hollande in the 2012 presidential vote. Sarkozy had been expected to attempt a political comeback in time for the next presidential poll in 2017, but those plans could be torpedoed after being charged in this case.
More than 2 million people are facing food insecurity because of drought, deficient harvests, and conflict in Somalia. The United Nations emergency directors are calling for more sustained funding for Somalia 3 years after the worst famine. A Taliban suicide bomber killed 8 military officers and wounded 13 others in an attack on an Air Force bus in the Afghan capital, Kabul. The Taliban claimed responsibility for the blast on the social media network Twitter, adding that the suicide attacker approached the vehicle on foot before detonating his explosives-packed vest. Beijing has warned Tokyo against infringing on China's sovereignty and security interests, following Japan's shift away from its pacifist constitution and towards a more assertive military. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe announced on Tuesday that his cabinet had formally endorsed a reinterpretation of a constitutional clause banning the use of force except in certain circumstances, a move that Beijing called a threat to Asia's security.
Referring to Japan's lifting of the ban on collective self-defense, China has showed its concern for many times and requires Japan not to harm China's sovereignty and security interests. We urge Japan to adhere to the road of peaceful development and handle related issues cautiously. Japan should respect its Asian neighbors, reasonable security concern, and not to do things against the regional peace and stability.
U.S. President Barack Obama, who is enduring a tough second term, has topped a list of the worst U.S. leaders since World War II. A new poll revealed that 33% of those asked saw Obama as the worst leader in the last 70 years, while 28% picked his predecessor, George W. Bush. The survey also showed that only 40% of Americans approved of Obama's handling of the economy and management of foreign policy. And the UN Refugee Agency has reported that around 75 migrants are lost at sea, according to survivors of a shipwreck off the Italian coast, who were plucked to safety by the Navy. The incident comes only 3 days after the bodies of 45 migrants were discovered on board an overcrowded fishing boat, also off the coast of Sicily. With the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan, the annual International Holy Quran exhibition opened its doors to visitors in the Iranian capital, Tehran. Our correspondent Hussein Dabash attended the opening ceremony and filed this report.
The 22nd Annual International Holy Quran exhibition continues to attract visitors from across the world. The exhibition kicked off on Sunday, simultaneously on the first day of Islam's holy month of Ramadan. The holy month of Ramadan is when the Holy Quran is believed by all Muslims to have been revealed to the Prophet Muhammad over 1400 years ago. Everything that has to do with Islam's holiest book, the Quran, is here. Quranic calligraphy, designs, fashions, kids' stories, and more can be found in the heart of the Iranian capital in this year's fair. One of this year's most sought-after attraction is the 24-karat gold engraved Holy Quran.
This is Islam's holiest book. It took us 6 months to work with gold and to engrave the letters one by one in this 100% pure gold Quran. Visitors are flocking to see this book because of its unique size and how we managed to put all these several hundred pages of the Quran in micro letters in a 2-page golden book.
Over 30 foreign publishers of the Quran and its translations are present in this year's event. Dozens of Iranian publishers are also present, including those who specialize in defining the meaning of the revelations of Islam's holiest book. People from all walks of life are here, as you can see, and even Iranian senior officials and clerics can be found browsing around.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has always put emphasis that not only politics and religion are one, but religion and everyday life is one. The laws of Islam are all in the Quran. The religion of Islam is peaceful. For example, what we are witnessing in the region by those committing acts of terror in the name of Islam are nothing more than terrorists that want to destroy this pure religion.
Paintings, storytelling, plays, computer games, and competitions are arranged in this year's event to attract everyone to the Holy Book. Organizers of the event say that one of the goals of this event is to promote the teachings of the Holy Quran. The exhibition is one of the largest that is held every year in Tehran and lasts throughout Islam's holy month of Ramadan. The event is known as the Mobile Exhibition because its location changes every year to promote the Quran's different meanings. For Iranians, the Holy Quran symbolizes religion, art, beauty, knowledge, and power. Speaking of power, this year's event is being held at one of the biggest museums in the Iranian capital, Tehran, and that is the Sacred Defense Museum. Reporting for AEE TV, Hussein Dabash, Tehran.
About 26% of Sudan is covered in forests, and only 11% of which are protected by the Ministry of Agriculture and Natural Resources in order to preserve the diverse animal and plant species. Ahmed Saeed Ahmed, our correspondent in Sudan, has more.
This is a spot by the eastern bank of the White Nile. Since 1932 and before the birth of the modern-day Sudan, this forest has been recognized and registered as a reservation as well as a bird and animal sanctuary.
It's just behind us, the Sunnis Forest, one of the international wetland momentums.
Researchers say birds travel long distances across continents and along certain routes, but they stop for rest as well as nesting, feeding and roosting.
First of all, the trip they make is known to be one of the longest migration routes. So they have to rest for feeding on certain stations. And one of them is the Sunnit Forest and other parts of Sudan, which are known to be like important bird areas or bottleneck areas.
It's a natural habitat of more than 920 species of bird. It's the natural roosting and resting site for more than 47 internationally soaring and migratory birds that crossing this forest.
Many other species actually also share the forest, including reptiles, amphibians and small mammals. Monkeys are visibly having fun everywhere, and wildcats can also be detected from time to time. Effectively a reservation, a bird sanctuary as well as a forest, Gaba do Sul is not located out into the wilderness. In fact, it's located here in the hot, arid terrain of the state of Khartoum.
Sunnit Forest is the main forest of Khartoum state, the point of the junction of the White and Blue Nile.
Not only spectacularly located, but it is a forest with other crucial benefits for the city of Khartoum.
During the flood season, it helps in slowing down the water currents going towards Khartoum and the housing. It's known to be a grazing area for so many local communities and people.
As is the case with many natural sites, however, experts argue more efforts are needed to keep the forest in good shape.
The thing is to maintain the forest as it is and to help educate people to use the forest in a good way in terms of the use of burning plastic in the forest, which is severely affecting the habitats, cutting the trees without the monitoring of the authorities is one of the main issues affecting the forest.
Fishing aficionados and bird watchers have Al Sunnit Forest at the top of the list of places to go, as well as regular tea and coffee drinkers. Ahmed Saeed Ahmed, Al Ittijah News Channel, Khartoum.
You've tuned into Al Ittijah World News with me, Mariam Khaddad. Here are our headlines. Fierce clashes erupt between Palestinians and Israeli occupation forces in occupied Al-Quds following the murder of a Palestinian teenager. The latest round of nuclear negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 kick off in Vienna after Tehran warned that excessive demands would hinder the talks. Moscow and Kiev agree on a roadmap of measures for ending the crisis in Ukraine. The Iraqi army makes further advances against Islamic State militants in the strategic city of Tikrit. Well, those are our headlines. Thanks for watching and have a good night.